Good morning. Welcome to the first class in this series. I'll begin just with a couple logistical points. This is a 12-week course. If you guys want to, I'm not going to use the microphone, so if you just move forward. Oh. So it's a 12-week course, and we'll try to meet every other week. We'll do our best to meet every other week. It's going to be a slower period for a while, so I think we can probably stick to that for the most part. And what I will say, a couple of things. One is that the material does build. Some people were in the previous class, and those were really very drop-in sessions. This class, the material does build over time. If you miss anything, it's on YouTube. You know, the recordings are on YouTube, so you can catch up that way if you miss a class. Just like last time on the event page on the website, at the bottom of each class on the calendar, you'll find a link called course materials. And you may have seen already before today, there was sort of a PDF that was kind of a broad level overview of where we're going, kind of a little pamphlet. As of today, there's also a 2-week workbook there. And there will be 2-week workbooks for every class that we do. They won't be referred to, just like in the previous class. I think the best way to get the most out of the course is to take a look at the workbook and see if there's anything there that resonates with you, that you want to spend the 2 weeks in between each session trying to go a little bit more deeply into the material. But they won't be referred to in the course itself. Unless somebody wants to bring up a point or a question about them, then we can address that. But those will always be there week by week as we go through. Yeah.
Find the YouTube recording.
So on the homepage, tnlsf.org, on the top left, it says our YouTube channel. It's the best way to find it. Right. So those are just some of the, and then one other point about this class will work in the same way, very similar way to the previous course in terms of every session will be broadly divided into 3 sections. We'll present the material for about half an hour, do some question and answer, then small group discussion, then a meditation. So we'll follow that. I think it's a good format that we'll follow that same format. So it'll be a little bit more, and I can promise there will be no role playing. I think role playing is evil. I will not make anyone do it. And you don't have to do the small group discussion if you don't want to. You can read or, but I can promise there will be no role playing in the course. So. All right.
Have you ever do a series on the evil?
Wouldn't take very long. I mean, it's just mean to make people, if they're not expecting it, to like people show up and be like, oh, pretend that you're such. It's awful. All right. So this course, there was a fairly long description of this course, on the event page. And what I can say is that there's a central premise or a central question that we're going to pursue over these 12 weeks. And we're going to keep coming back to this one central question, one central premise, which is really, where does happiness, where does contentment, where does a sense of genuine purpose, where does it come from? And are we, up until now, have we been pursuing it in the best way? Have we been pursuing it in the most useful way? And can we train the mind to look at it in a different way and to pursue it in a way that's more effective? So we will be looking at that through a variety of different lenses and approaches, but that's the through line for the entire course that we're going to relate everything to. So, in this graphic here, funny story, when I was trying to create this graphic, I said in the prompt, I was like, give me like the mind of a spiritual practitioner inspired by Inside Out. And I was like, I can't do that. That violates copyright. But if you just change the prompt, you can get this is what I wanted, you know. So that's kind of this idea is like when we become someone who focuses, who understands, ultimately, if we're gonna spoil the course off the bat, then what I would say is what we're going to learn is that true happiness, genuine contentment, and real purpose are states of mind. They are internal, mental states of mind, rather than things that we get from interacting with things that are outside of ourselves. And we're going to really do a deep dive over 12 weeks and what that means. So let me pause. Were there any thoughts or questions about just any of the logistical things or anything that I've said so far? And if there's anybody on Zoom that would like to just unmute and ask, that's fine too. All right. So what we're going to look at here is what model of happiness are we following? And what we're going to see in this first class is that the drive to be happy, the drive to experience contentment, peace of mind, inner joy, inner tranquility is universal. It's not something that only spiritual people are interested in. It isn't even something that only people are interested in, right? If you observe animals, naturally they will move toward things that they find pleasant, things that they're stimulated, attracted to, that they're interested in, food and whatnot, and they will move away from things that they have learned are aversive, things that are painful, things that are unpleasant. That's a natural drive that all sentient beings share. But what is problematic is defining it only by the coming together, so for animals, right, they have a very instinctual process, right? They operate on the level of instinct. And what we're going to see is that as animals, we have a tendency to operate on the level of instinct as well, on the level, this sort of subconscious, automatic drive, kind of a autopilot, just like lower animals, we have a tendency to do the same thing. So for a lower animal, their view is that happiness is the coming together of outer conditions, right? When they can find the food, when they can, find the shade and then move into the heat and then the shade and go back and forth, and they can get a sense of equilibrium, a sense of inner, calm on the basis of what they're able to accumulate, how they're able to interact, then they define that as happiness. And the problem is we often do the same thing. The idea of the American dream, right, is having the white picket fence, 2.5 kids, the right kind of job that pays enough money, having a spouse and, so on. And those are all external things, right? This is a sense of accumulation, a sense of how we can interact with the world to feel comfortable, to feel at ease, to feel, that things are working out. But if we can ask the question, is there a better way? Is that thesis, is that the problem? Is that thesis what is causing us to suffer when that thesis goes wrong? Because, unavoidably, we are not in control of every one of our interactions, every one of our experiences. We're not in control of our health completely. We're not in control of the things, whether we lose our job, whether we get a divorce, whether someone passes away, whether there's a pandemic that sweeps the world and, everything that we've been accustomed to is taken away or altered fundamentally. We're not in control of our aging process, of the fact that this life is going to come to an end. There's innumerable things that we don't really have control over. And when our model of happiness is dependent upon being in control of what we contact and what we don't contact, then we're going to suffer unnecessarily every day, really, not just like sometimes, but every day will be full of unnecessary pain and suffering and strife and difficulty. So if we can change how we approach, how we go about feeling content, feeling fulfilled, feeling satisfied, having a life of meaning, and we can see it through what we really do control, right? At least in theory. In theory, we control our own mind, right? That's the one thing that we have access to. We don't really have access to other people's behaviors, other people's choices, things that happen, but we have control over our thoughts, at least, again, in theory. We know that even that is a difficult ask, right? Being truly in control of our own thoughts, our own responses, is a lifelong process of gaining that control over time. But it's the only thing that can work, right? If something is going to work, being able to train the mind in the right direction over time is all that there really is, because training externalities is impossible, but we do have some control over how we respond to externalities, how we respond to losing our job, how we respond to someone passing away, how we respond to our own aging process and coming to grips with our own mortality, and how we relate, what lens do we see others when we're in relationship with people around us. So this is, if you'll review later that PDF that I mentioned, that's kind of this pamphlet for the course, which is in the link on the website. I've kind of defined the 12 sessions as following kind of 3 different phases that are doing different things. Right now, we're in the first session, and as you can see here, I've defined phase 1 of the 12 sessions as what's called here establishing the ground. So we're going to lay the foundation, lay the groundwork for what we're talking about, which is to understand what is it, what are the difficulties that we're facing, and then how do we develop an inner sense of resilience, an inner sense of having tools, having capacities to be able to address these problems. So that's going to be over the first 5 sessions. That's going to be what we focus on. And then phase 2, classes 6 through 9, will be once we've identified that ground and we've established some tools, some sense of resilience, then we're going to really look at what, we're going to turn that process back toward ourselves, and we're going to think about how, as it says, what desires, what motivations are present in our lives. How do they create suffering? How do they set the stage for being happier, being more content, having greater meaning? and really understanding in a deep way the relationship between the mind and our experiences, the results of our actions, looking at how the whole process of how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to others is a very active mental process. So we're going to question assumptions that we have about, is it possible to gain more compassion? Is it possible to gain more connection with others and have a life that doesn't depend on things working out, that doesn't depend on, because again, that's so unstable, right? If we resign our happiness to I can only be happy if, or I can only be happy when, then, when things work out, when everything comes together, when things are going well, then that means I will be unhappy when, I will suffer when, things will be terrible when. We are giving away all of our power. We're giving away all of our capacity, all of our internal reserves. So we're going to really look at how all of these experiences are shaped by our beliefs, by our motivations, our desires, our sense of ourselves, our sense of others. That will be the second phase of the overall course. And then phase 3 is so this is 10, 11, and 12, the end of the course. We're going to, over the first 2 phases, it's a lot of inner work. It's a lot of thinking about our motivations, our capacities, our inner reserves. And then once we've kind of focused on those tools and we've looked at how to do that inner work, now, and this is a very Buddhist idea, this course, it's inspired by Buddhist ideas in many ways, but it like the previous course, it's never going to rely on concepts that are uniquely found in Buddhism. So karma, reincarnation, things of that sort. Those are not addressed in this particular course. But Buddhism agrees, I would say that Buddhist philosophy agrees with everything that's in this course, because I find Buddhist philosophy to be a comprehensive cognitive psychology in a way of thinking. So what Buddhism would say is that that you have to do a lot of inner work in order for your outer work to go well, right? You can't just expect that your relationships with others and the way that you deal with or handle stress or anxiety or being disappointed, those things, being able to navigate that depends upon being prepared to navigate that, right? You're not going to just wake up. It's a lot like, dealing with challenges in driving, right? If you are just driving in a neighborhood, of course, that's quite, you can do that even when you're 16. You're like, this is the gas, and quite quickly you can navigate a parking lot, you can navigate a neighborhood, but you can't navigate a snowstorm. You can't navigate, ice on the road and, strong winds and so on. That requires that you build up skills and capacity and tools gradually over time. And then you're prepared when that actually happens. And the Buddhist philosophy and this philosophy have that in common, that we spend a lot of time preparing the inner ground, and then that allows for being able to be in relationship with others well and being able to create new habits, new tendencies that don't depend upon things being the way that we need them to be or feeling like, because that impulse has been with us you could say, if I'm going to just immediately violate what I said, it's been with us from beginningless past lives, according to the Buddhist view, but it's been with us at least since birth, right? So, I mean, this externalizing of our happiness, this externalizing of our sense of meaning and purpose, it's a very deeply ingrained viewpoint. And so, because it's when we're a baby, right, and we cry, we get the bottle, we get the thing that we want. And so we think, oh, well, I was upset and I got what I want because something was brought into my experience, or I was upset and I got what I wanted because something was taken away from my experience, something was removed. They turned the sound of the TV down, or they turned it up, or they gave me food, or they gave me the blanket. So we learn that I get more comfortable, when I can manipulate my external environment. And that drive has been with us, at least since then, right? So undoing that or dismantling that is our life's work, right? We're stuck with it right now. And so it's completely natural that we're externalizing or giving away our power, to be truly content and happy and have this inner wellspring or this inner reserve. Um, but we're able to, on the basis of doing that inner work, be in relationship with others in a way. And what we'll see is we're going to, I mean, I think it's been sort of clear that we're going to look at one model, but we're going to replace it with a new model, right? It isn't just like we're going to say, well, this doesn't work, and so, oh no, we're going to actually think, well, what model can we then actually use that's more effective, that will work? But real spiritual progress, whether it's Buddhist or whether it's more secular, it's slow, right? We're not going to get to the end of the course and everything is going to be perfect, but we're going to learn how to move in a better direction. And we'll see that the things here, when we can turn back outward to others on the basis of having made real progress internally, this phase 3 is where we're going to shift into. We're going to see that developing real connection with others, developing empathy, developing compassion, um, and being able to relate to others from that place is going to do a lot of work in terms of generating that inner contentment, that inner peace of mind. Okay. All right. That's just, again, that's kind of in the first class to give you a sense of what's happening, where we're going. Any thoughts or questions, Zoom or in person? Oh, so, yeah, I think we've covered these points. Right. So this is a little bit more introducing here the model, again, the model that we've grown up with the model that's reinforced in our society, the model that I think, we just learn because it's very easy to develop a sense of thinking that some things in our environment are made out of pleasure and some things in our environment are made out of pain, right? That's a very simplistic way of just moving through life, which is this outside in model, right? That we've kind of all absorbed over the course of our life. And when we do that, we, as it says here, one, we're stuck on this hedonic treadmill, right? This never-ending seeking for novelty, for new stimulation, for like, oh, but I did that already. How can I make that better? How can I took a vacation last year. I've got to do something better this year. We already did that. How can I have an even better experience? And then to go, I don't know. I always have trouble because it's new for me to not talk a lot about traditional Buddhist ideas. And there's this overlap. So it's always hard for me to figure out like how much detail of one or the other what is useful. But this is very much what the Buddha taught, in his first noble truth, the truth of unsatisfactory conditions, right? That everything that the bad news about, it's all bad news in the first noble truth. It gets better when you go through the second, the third, and the fourth. It gets progressively better. The first noble truth is a real bummer. And of that, the thing here in terms of this hedonic treadmill is that the real problem is that everything that we label as happiness, the Buddha would call the suffering of change, right? Or changeable suffering, which means a couple of things, right? One is it means that nothing really is lasting, right? Everything is, because it's all being mediated through our senses, the five bodily senses and then the mental sense. And so necessarily it fades, right? It's not, you can only eat so much food or drink or, go to the beach for so many hours or whatnot. Everything is temporary. Everything is, if it depends upon things that are outside of oneself, then those things came together under causes and conditions, and they by their own nature, they're temporary. But there's a deeper level too, which refers to that pleasure-seeking behavior is the result of a sense of dissatisfaction in the mind, right? We don't we don't put music on, we don't call up a friend, we don't bake cookies, we don't watch a movie, unless there's some idea that the present moment is unsatisfactory, that there's something agitating about what I'm going through right now. So we feel hunger, we feel boredom, we feel anxious, we feel, something unpleasant, and then we seek some new stimulation to deal with that existing dissatisfactory experience, the hunger, the boredom, the anxiety, whatever it might be. And that new stimulus comes along with its own attendant suffering, meaning that the more you do it, the less pleasant it becomes by its own nature. It can't do anything other than that because its nature isn't happiness. And so it has no capacity to do anything but other, as it says here, for the satisfaction of that activity to fade and to be replaced with a new unsatisfactory experience. And then you seek a new stimulus. You seek something, so let's say you're bored, right? And so you think, and what happens then is that we think about what's in my wheelhouse? What are my options, right? I can't get on a probably I can't get on a jet and go to Paris for lunch, right? That most people can't do that. So that, but you can go to the movies. You can, put on Netflix or whatever. Those are options that are in your environment. So you think about like, okay, well, last time I felt this way, what did I do? And then you probably will do something similar. Like we have similar ways of dealing with these things over time. And it might work for a period of time, right? But what would happen if you were like, oh, this new movie came out, I want to see it. So you go see it, and then it's over. You're like, oh, that was cool. Like, I enjoyed that. I had, like, for the whole hour and a half, I was engaged. It could be the opposite, right? You could be wrong. You could think it's a good movie and you'd be like, oh, this is terrible. You get up and now you're actively, things are worse, right? Because you were mistaken about how it was going to go. But best case scenario, like you were engaged, it went well. But then let's say that there's a strap that comes out of the armrests and the leg rests, and you're stuck to the chair after it ends. And then they play the movie again. And now you're like, I just saw this movie. Yeah, it was cool, but I don't want to see it. I don't want to be here for 4 hours. I certainly don't want to be here for 6 or for 8, right? Because now you're going to get hungry. Now you're going to get thirsty. Now you're going to want to go outside, be in nature, call up a friend. You're that. So the thing, and nobody told you to go to the movie. Nobody told you to play that album. Nobody told you to make that delicious food that gets replenished and that you have to eat 4 more plates of, or the album that starts over again that you can't turn off, or the friend that you called up who doesn't leave, right? Nobody told you to pick that activity. You picked it because you said this is what generally I think is going to work for my boredom, for my dissatisfactory experience, right? But it can't really work because it's going to come along with its own attendant suffering that becomes more noticeable at a certain point. You yourself will become motivated to end that activity just because it's not happiness, right? Because it's not in the nature of happiness. So you might be really engaged all the way through the one time, but you certainly don't want to do it 2 or 3 or 4 times because, and which demonstrates it's not in the nature of happiness. If it was in the nature of happiness, the more you engaged with it, the happier you would be. Necessarily, that would be its essence, its nature, to make you happy. The more you did it, the happier and happier you would become. So what we'll see is there is something that is like that, but it's not an externality. It's not something that you can bring in or remove from your environment. And so it comes along. So that's the first problem with this story is that we're trapped on a hedonic treadmill because it fundamentally can't work in the way that we think that it does. And then also there's this element of clinging and grasping. Again, this giving away of our happiness, this relinquishing of our power, of our control by saying that, what if that movie is sold out? What if it's not as good as I thought? What if it's raining and I don't want to actually drive in, pouring down rain? And so I'm like, oh, there's this movie, but I really, the effort that it's going to take for me to get there is just not worth it. And then you're even more frustrated, right? Because you're like, I want to do it, but I can't. Um, so then our whole lives are not only trapped on this treadmill, but they're also conditioned by clinging and grasping, by introducing this way of thinking that saying my happiness is dependent upon controlling my external conditions, never being separated from what I find pleasant and never encountering what I find unpleasant. And that's an impossible task, to always be in contact with what one finds pleasant and never being in contact with what one finds unpleasant. We're setting ourselves up to fail. And then our whole lives are going to be conditioned by clinging and grasping to these external situations. So this is the part, if we go back, this is part of laying the foundation of seeing this model that we've internalized, seeing it very clearly. And again, this is very Buddhist in its nature, that you have to clearly identify that's the purpose of the first noble truth, right? Is to clearly identify what the problem is, that there are unsatisfactory conditions. If you never clearly define the problem, you'll never pick a really effective solution. You'll never be motivated. And most of the people on the earth aren't. They're perfectly happy, like settling for this level of happiness, right? Being, if they feel like, generally speaking, most of the time, they can get the food delivered when they want it delivered, and they can make it be what they want, and they can live in the right kind of house, and then that's sufficient. We've been taught that that's what happiness is. That's all that happiness is, and as long as it works out like 51% of the time, like good enough, we're okay with that. But if we can really understand that this model is not a good model, and that there's a better model, which is actually the inside out model, but this is the outside in, we're going to learn the inside out model, going from the outside to the inside rather than the outside to the inside. When we can really learn that, then we open up new possibilities. We open up, new abilities to not give away our ability to be happy to what is occurring in the environment. Okay. So this is the kind of fundamental question that we need to explore. What if it is true that I don't have to depend upon that which happens to me in order to sometimes feel content, in order to sometimes feel like things are going well? But what if it can be actively cultivated so that I can rely on my own mind, what's present in my own experience, which is something that can be with me at all times? Um, and again, this is sort of a east-west class. So, and of course, Buddhism doesn't deny that we have a brain, a physical brain, and it doesn't deny that the mind and the brain are intimately interconnected. And it is true, and it is true that when you meditate, or when there are structural changes in the brain. So if that helps you to think about it in that way, we do create new pathways, new neural pathways, new, structural, on the basis of intentionally training the mind, and they see this in meditators and so on. Their brains are physically different after months and months of meditating. And so, yeah. So this is the inside out model, the model that we're actually going to cultivate over these 12 weeks. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah.
I think you put that on that 15 to 20 seconds for a positive experience. The flip side of that is that a negative experience is instant and potentially longer lasting.
Yeah. Yeah, the negativity bias that we have. Yeah, so the comment from the Gompa was talking about how it's also true. Of course, nothing is always only positive. There's always ways of that And it is true that we are hardwired, which I think is why we have to overcome, right? When something aversive happens, and this is, certainly when you eat something, right, for example, and you get sick, you're naturally hardwired to avoid that food, even though it's just one time, right? And it may not have been caused by that food. You may have had the flu and you ate something, but still you'll avoid that food for a while because we have an innate negativity bias where and it's a survival instinct, right? It's adaptive to emphasize things that are dangerous, right? There's no real survival benefit to stopping and smelling the flowers and thinking like, oh, that's amazing, what a like that doesn't help you live longer. But noticing the lion, and running away or feeling that fear, that you will live longer. Like so we are hardwired to prioritize aversive things, and they do stick with us longer, which is why we have to work harder. As it said, we have to actually intentionally do the opposite. We have to intentionally focus on what's positive, accentuate the positive and diminish the negative, right? To overcome that innate negativity bias that is adaptive, that does help us to navigate poisons and dangers and things in our environment.
How do you define the difference between the brain and the mind? What is the mind?
Well, it depends on the question from the Gompa is what is the difference between the brain and the mind? And of course, it's going to depend upon a person's. This course isn't going to require a person to make a distinction if they don't want to. In Buddhism, they do make a distinction because no one, what His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he does these mind and life conferences, and he's very interested in engaging in neuroscientists and so on. And what's true, what we can definitely say is true, is that there's a lot of materialistic assumptions that are built into the traditional model, right? Where because they want to create replicable, testable hypotheses. And so they exclude certain ways of thinking about it in order to create a system that's replicable and that's testable, and there are hypotheses you can generate. But what they think, or what they postulate, is that that we can't say what changes what. Like, what's interesting is when we know that meditators who are choosing to concentrate their mind in certain ways show changes in the brain. So what that is and we have control over, so the mind is our subjective experience. The mind is our thoughts, our feelings, our subjective experience. And the brain is a physical organ that certainly, again, a person could certainly get a lot out of this course, or everything I think that's intended out of this course, without postulating that there is something that survives death or something that existed before this life, which is the Buddhist view, is that the mind and the brain are separate continua that become deeply interconnected. But it's unavoidably true, even from a scientific perspective, that we can choose to focus on certain things, like compassion person can do 3 or 4 months or 6 months of compassion meditation, and structural changes in the brain will emerge at the end of that 12 months or 6 months, and they have the MRI scans, the PET scans to prove that, to demonstrate that. And that subjective experience having an impact in the physical world, right? Because no one's telling you to concentrate the mind in that way. You're choosing to concentrate the mind in that way, and it results in physical changes in the brain. Um, so that's a very interesting thing. Like you can't think about your liver doing something and then your liver does something different, right? You can't choose to make your liver more efficient by hoping, but you can physically change the structure of your brain by what you concentrate your mind on, by what thoughts you focus on. Um, so Buddhism would say that the mind and the brain are two completely separate continua that are deeply interconnected, because certainly damage to the brain can prevent certain subjective experiences from arising or change the way in which they arise. It can change your ability to process language, to speak, to see, to hear, to plan. Some damage to the brain can result in um, reduced impulse control. You can become more emotional, less uh, because the different part. So certainly Buddhism agrees with all of that damage because the mind and the brain are deeply interconnected. Damage to the brain can prevent or shift or change. But what Buddhism would say is that the mind itself isn't being impacted. It's the expression of that mind in a particular form that is impacted for the duration of that form due to damage that has occurred in that form. Um, but again, you don't have to accept that hypothesis in order to participate in this class. There's nothing like that. But that's the Buddhist answer: is that that they are two completely separate phenomenon. But I do think, going back to neuroplasticity, there must still be some distinction that we can draw between subjective awareness and the physical brain itself. And one can't simply be an emergent property of the other because it works in reverse. Because when we put the mind on something, the brain itself changes. And so it is not a one-way street. It's at least, a loop of some sort. Any other thoughts or questions?
Is this fair comment that sort of, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am? Would it be the inverse for Buddhism? I am, therefore I think.
Mm, I mean, certainly Buddhism would say that all sentient beings, because in Tibetan, sentient being is mind possessor, Samchen, mind possessor. In English, sentient being. We're sentient beings, lower animals are sentient beings. In Buddhism, they would postulate other types of sentient beings other than humans and animals. Um, and they postulate that consciousness isn't unique to, again, this has nothing to do with this class, but you ask. Um,
Radical.
um, so mind, what Buddhism would say is that as human beings, our mind is having the experience of a human being. And because we're having the experience of a human being, that is very, very tied to our physical form. So again, damage, we could have a stroke, we could have a car accident, all kinds of things could impact. Um, but that's also, but then animals are having a very different experience, but their minds are not fundamentally different than our minds. They're just having a very different experience because they have a very different form. And that's also true of all of the other types of existence. Um, so what we could say is that it does change radically, that mind itself is that which is clear and knowing, that which possesses clarity and awareness. But it changes radically in dependence upon which realm that mind is appearing in, what kind of experience that mind is having. So, and that's true, enlightened beings. Again, this class has nothing to do with enlightenment, but enlightened beings are simply consciousness having a different kind of experience. So all sentient beings are mind possessors. So you could say that all sentient beings are characterized by subjective experience, subjective awareness, being a host to consciousness. But it is radically different depending on which type of sentient being you're talking about. There's no commonality between, and it isn't the nature of the mind, it's really the nature of the form that mind is being expressed through. And that changes even over the course of a lifetime. A person develops Alzheimer's, right? Their subjective experience very different than before they had Alzheimer's. They get a stroke. Their subjective experience is very different than before they had the stroke. Things of that sort. Okay, so we are going to, so I guess we should do the small group discussion first, because that's typically how we do it. So the small group discussion is here on the screen, and I will leave you to it. Those of you online, you can have your own small group discussion there, and it will not be, none of this will get recorded, none of this will be in the YouTube video. So this will all be private and cut out. So I will come back at 10 after 11, which is in about 18 minutes. And then we'll do the meditation at the end. Okay. All right, so we end all of these classes with a meditation. It's an analytical meditation, which you may or may not be familiar with. It is something that analytical meditation is very common in Tibetan Buddhism. And the goal of an analytical meditation is to follow a particular chain of reasoning or chain of logic or argumentation in order to generate an insight in your mind. So really, it's a specialized form of thinking. Sometimes we think of meditation as just a clearing of the mind or a not thinking, and that's not what meditation is from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. You always have an object of meditation, even if the object is just the physical sensation of your breath. That's an object, right? You've decided, I'm going to do 5 minutes of concentrating my awareness on the breath, which means anything that's not the physical sensation of the breath is not the object. So you notice when your mind has gone off of the object and you bring your mind back onto the object. There's never just, I'm going to not think, I'm going to not, I'm just going to be blank. It's not possible. You could try to be blank, but you would have some sort of mental representation of a white screen or a black screen or staticky screen or something would appear to your mind. It's not possible to have nothingness appear to your mind. Which kind of gets at your question. We are mind possessors. We are sentient beings. So the mind is going to function. The goal is to give it something to focus on. And for an analytical meditation, the insights that we're trying to generate are constructive, beneficial, useful ways of thinking, ways of acting, ways of understanding, because the premise is that by doing that every day, that insight will seep into the mind and we'll be able to act from a place of familiarity with that insight. That's the why people do it, is because if you do it a lot for a long time, you become different. Your new familiarity, your new habit, your new insight becomes your baseline. So instead of anger being your baseline, compassion could be your baseline, by meditating on compassion, as an example. So every session in this course will end with an analytical meditation. So just sit comfortably. When we meditate, we try to establish a upright posture, something that is stable. So set your body in position of stability, trying not to be too hunched, to be too leaned, just upright. And try to bring your awareness inward, away from your environment, constraining your awareness to your body and your mind, letting go of thoughts of the past, plans for the future, concentrating your awareness in the present by attending closely to the physical sensation that accompanies the in-breath and the out-breath, in the space around the opening of the nostrils, breathing naturally, normally, just giving yourself the instruction to quickly notice when anything other than that one physical sensation is arising in the mind, and then without judgment or frustration to lift your awareness up from that distraction and to place it gently but firmly again and again on the breath. And the purpose of this meditation will be to develop some insight into our happiness seeking habits, just to see it clearly, to bring to mind something that you wish for, something ordinary, something at work, something in your personal life, but something specific. Begin to notice the quality of the mind, the quality of that wanting, not the object, but moving toward the object. The sense that things must not be quite right. that having, bringing in, will fix something. I think, what is it that would be satisfied? The inner experience that would arrive, feeling of ease or relief. And trace this pattern in your life backwards. The process of reaching toward conditions in the hope of an inner ease. Different objects over time with the same structure. If I had this, then I would be okay. Notice that it's there from morning until night. Often unexamined. But notice too that now you are observing. You do have the capacity to notice the reaching and not simply to reach. And that awareness is what we will cultivate. And then sit with the question, is there a version of ease, of peace, of being okay that doesn't depend on reaching? Just examine that. And when you're ready, we'll come back together. All right, any final thoughts or questions? Just unmute if you're on Zoom. Well, thanks for coming. I'm not encouraged to talk to myself, so it's quite good that there are people here. Of course, thanks for coming. So yeah, we'll carry on in 2 weeks. Gendon begins teaching tomorrow on the Noble Eightfold Path, which is kind of a more Buddhist version of this class. It's like what the Buddha's prescription is for a good life is the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's what his class is going to be on. It starts tomorrow. More specifically Buddhist than. Oh yeah, 10 to 11:30.